Welcome to ESG Decoded, where we navigate the evolving landscape of environmental, social, and governance, ESG. Join me, Amanda Kuhl, Erica Schiller, and Anna Stablem as we explore the intersection of sustainability, innovation, and ethical leadership, the dynamic forces shaping our global economy. Welcome, everyone, to ESG Decoded. I'm Amanda Kuhl, your host today. I'm super excited to have Chad Spitler on as our guest. We talk a lot about innovations and policies on this podcast around decarbonization and restoring nature. And something I'm really excited to be exploring today with Chad is really what's happening, what are the trends with the teams who are actually doing this hard work. What's new, what's notable in the organizational structures, hot new jobs in the world of sustainability, and really digging into who's doing this whole work and what can we learn to be most efficient and effective in our work. And of course, some of the underlying trends and drivers of why this is so important. Anyways, real quick introduction to Chad. He is the founder and CEO of Third Economy, where he advises institutional investors and companies in the areas of sustainable investing, impact measurement, data analytics, proxy voting, shareholder engagement, and ESG. He's also currently a professor at the Presidio Graduate School. And Chad previously worked as a partner at Camberview, where he headed the firm's advisory services on sustainable business practices. And prior to Camberview, he spent 15 years at BlackRock, most recently as the managing director and COO of the corporate governance and responsible investment team. Chad, welcome to the ESG Decoded podcast.
Thank you, Amanda. It's great to be here.
Lovely to have you on the show. I'm really excited about digging into this topic of, again, the teams who are doing this hard work and leading the strategy around decarbonization, saving nature, a variety of sustainability issues. And would love to hear a little bit from you about what are the big trends you're seeing in the industry and the teams.
Well, one of the biggest trends that we're seeing is emerging regulation around sustainability data. And that's having profound implications for those of us in the field. I think a lot of sustainability professionals have long been seeking regulation. Good policy can really create effective disclosure, and investors really like to have a steady policy environment where they can plan on integrating that into their investment analysis. So the emerging regulation is positive in many ways, in the sense that we're going to get that policy environment that investors are looking for, and we're going to hopefully see some use of frameworks and standards that will allow for comparable data. But as a result, what's happening is this information is now making its way into regulated documents. So there's a higher level of scrutiny. And you have more legal advisors starting to get involved and controllers starting to get involved. So there's a fundamental shift happening right now in the sustainability field as this data moves from voluntary to regulated. And that's what I look forward to catching up with you more about as we continue to speak today.
And then, Chad, when you're referring to the policies and regulations, are you referring, for example, in the U.S., the SEC climate disclosure rules in California, the European requirements? Is that what you're referring to? As it kind of, I know they're all different, a little bit different, but just broadly.
Precisely.
Okay.
Some of them are climate specific. Some are more broad, and they pertain to sustainability generally. We're tracking about 62 global regulations right now. If you think about the economy that we operate in, so many companies are global in nature. So what the corporate side is really concerned about is, how do we manage, if we're a global organization, all these different regulations? And there are some commonalities among them, which is great. We want to see that ability to compare. So the more the regulations are comparable across the globe, then the better it is for both investors and companies. But this is definitely a big area of focus right now. How are companies going to be able to surf all of these emerging regulations and successfully get investors what they're looking for?
And then because you work with a lot of investors, can you speak a little bit about that piece of, what are they looking for? I think you mentioned a little bit comparable data where they can really compare apple to apples from one potential investment to another when they're conducting due diligence. What else would you say are they really looking for?
Relevant data. I think one of the challenges with sustainability information is that different investors have different approaches. So that requires different information. So if you're an impact investor, you might be seeking different types of metrics than if you're, call it a mainstream ESG investor who's really focused on the financial aspects of the sustainability information. So the different investor approaches really drive the disclosures of companies as those investors seek to take that information and align it with their unique approach. I would say, if I think about what's common amongst most investors, is this concept of relevance or materiality. I'm always very careful with the term materiality because it means different things, especially in the US with the SEC meaning of materiality in terms of financial materiality. So I like to talk about relevance. So different relevance of sustainability data for different types of investors, but most of them are going to be interested in how do environmental, social, and governance factors relate to risk and return? And are you pricing that risk and return into your models effectively? So that's the majority of where we're seeing the sustainability data start to be disclosed is what's material, what's relevant, and how does this information relate to risk and return? But we're also seeing disclosure around impacts and this growing realization that every asset has an impact. Shouldn't we be measuring what that is? And shouldn't that impact measurement also be part of what we're assessing, not just risk and return, but the impact of our assets on the environment and society? Shouldn't that be something that we assess?
And what are you seeing? How are teams responding to this demand as far as how are they being organized, or what are they doing differently to be able to answer these questions?
Well, if you think about different sizes of organizations and growing complexity, so at one end of the spectrum, small startups, simpler business models. At the other end of the spectrum, large global conglomerates. Different organizations are responding in different ways. One of the governance structures that I always recommend, irrespective of size, is that to do sustainability reporting and disclosure effectively, you need to be able to draw upon a network of subject matter experts from within your organization. So if you think about the acronym ESG, where are you getting your environmental data from? Is it facilities? Is it data centers? Is it your travel? Is it waste? And that's really going to be very sector specific. For your social data, which I usually divide into people and communities, your own people, and then the people outside of your organization, the communities that you operate in. Maybe you need somebody from HR, or maybe you have a philanthropy team that's working with your communities, or maybe it's somebody in operations running a plant. So this ability to aggregate information from different subject matter experts is pretty common across the spectrum of the size of companies. So you need what I call the governance of sustainability in place in order to get that information and to report it. But what's happening is that as this information is starting to move from voluntary to regulated, we're starting to see more controllers get involved. People from the audit function, I would describe it broadly as more of that financial controller role, is starting to make its way now into what had traditionally been the role of the sustainability team to aggregate this information from these different subject matter experts and report it. Now we need this control function because investors are making decisions off of this information. It's going into regulated documents. So having a subject matter expert with a sticky note on their computer as the source of your information going into your SEC documents might be something that you want to tighten up a little bit.
It's really interesting to think about. I also love how when thinking about developing sustainability strategies, I think about how can we embed it in every single, like a major of the core functions of an organization, right, of a company. And I've always been thinking about how to connect it with finance. In the past, perhaps with like ESG loans or lines of credit, green bonds, things like that. But I also love this connection too, where again, there's this data that needs to be accurate, verifiable. In some cases, I believe some of these regulations require that it be third party assured at a certain point, there's thresholds. But
That's
to be able
correct.
to, again, in that example, a sticky note on someone's desk is not going to cut it anymore.
Not at all. And so as the sustainability data starts to make its way into more regulated documents that investors are using, we're seeing a trend of more control functions starting to partner with the sustainability professionals. Call them an ESG controller, for example. So that ESG controller is really moving into what had traditionally been the realm of the sustainability reporting team. And they're the ones that are confirming, hey, what is the source of your information? How accurate is that? And do we have an audit trail so that when we get that third party assurance, we can feel confident presenting them with truthful and accurate information? So that's one of the big trends that we're seeing today, especially around climate data. And what I see happening is these control functions, as they're starting to get more involved in sustainability disclosure, have to learn about sustainability. So if you think about the unique aspects of climate accounting and reporting, for example, it's not uncommon to have a rather high level of estimation in climate accounting. So a controller needs to get comfortable with that industry norm and practice and understand where we are as an industry in order to be an effective control function around that. Because if the expectation was, hey, all of our information has to be 100% sourced and we can't rely on estimates or gap fills, well, then we're going to have a problem, because that's the state of the industry right now. Is there is a reliance on gap filling, backfilling data based on estimates that, of course, we're improving over time. But that's a great example of where the ESG controller needs to have that understanding of the sustainability market.
And I could also see, hopefully, over time with someone in this function or this role, that hopefully we could get more of the primary data, right? Their source data. So it's less and less estimations with someone really driving the improvement of the quality of this type of reporting. I can see perhaps the biggest, larger organizations be able to afford a role like this. What happens with the smaller companies who, sure, still meet the threshold of regular required reporting? What would you advise there? I think it's a little bit too early to see what's happening, because I know those thresholds and the timelines don't kick in for a few more years. But any advice there if you can't afford a full-time ESG controller?
I think that is the key word, full-time, is that the smaller, earlier stage companies with simpler business models might not necessarily need a full-time controller. So it's those larger global conglomerates that are very complex that might merit this as a full-time job. The thing that I like to think about is, how do you create opportunity for your own employees? So you might have somebody in an internal audit role or a control function that has an interest and a passion that you want to help them explore as part of their own career development path. So for those simpler, smaller organizations, it might simply be adding it to an existing job description that, hey, one of your additional tasks is now to really help us develop expertise in understanding ESG and how we should control it. And it could be a small part of somebody's broader role. But for those really large, complex global organizations, that's where we're seeing them actually creating full-time jobs dedicated to ensuring the accuracy and quality of this information. I was meeting with a company recently a railway company, and their sustainability report is several hundred pages long. And they have a team of 3 people that works annually just on that report. So that's a great example of where it might merit having a full-time role really focused on controlling the quality and accuracy of those disclosures and complying with a variety of global regulations. In this case, it's a company that operates in multiple countries. So they have multiple regulatory regimes that they have to comply with. But if I think about my own company, Third Economy, we're a small consulting firm. We have 20 employees. It probably wouldn't make sense even for us to have a full-time controller, but certainly we're going to want to have that embedded into people's roles.
And Chad, I want to ask you another question. Even if a role like this is merited, we all know we have to make the ask of leadership. We have to convince them that this is worth it, even though you and I, we understand it's being regulated. Investors are asking for high quality data, relevant data. Any advice on getting that buy-in for this role or any major change like this that requires an investment essentially in sustainability?
Well, the first thing that I would recommend is if you're seeking budget to fund a role like this, that you first want to be able to demonstrate what is the value of the role. So what's the risk that you're mitigating and what are the opportunities that this might provide you? So I always like to think about risk versus opportunity and how those two things can be drivers of financial value. So if you think about the control function, the risk that you're mitigating is you're mitigating against lawsuits, you're mitigating against investors making incorrect information, you're mitigating against greenwashing, reputational risk, etc. So those are some of the points that I would use in making the case for why you need a controller on the risk mitigation side. On the opportunity side, as sustainability makes its way into product and service innovation, similarly, you want to make sure that your information that you're disclosing is of good quality so that investors can rely on it. Let's take, for example, the shift in the automotive industry from combustion engines to hybrids to electric vehicles. So investors are watching that shift in revenue as companies compete. Who's going to win in this macroeconomic trend towards electrification, and how do we pick the best investments to be part of that winning team? So in this case, the ESG controller really needs to be thinking about the revenue and how are we presenting this opportunity to investors for them to think about us as a possible source of their capital. So I always think about how do we use this to mitigate risk and how do we use this to communicate the financial opportunity.
That's really, I love that. Thank you so much for sharing that. I think it gives, hopefully our listeners some really practical ideas of how to approach this conversation and preparing for this ask in an organization. And I think, in any organization, right, we have to prioritize, and there's always a million asks, things that we would like to do. We're really thinking through, as you said, the risk and opportunities and be able to describe them, perhaps even quantify them to make the case. Anything else you could share about getting buy-in and convincing leadership?
Well, in my experience, boards and the C-suite have varying levels of interest in sustainability. For those of us on this podcast and that work in this field, we're passionate about this, but not everybody is as passionate as we are. But I do think that boards and C-suite are all very passionate about growing their companies and generating financial return for their shareholders and stakeholders. So the more that we can take our passion as sustainability professionals and tie it to everybody else's passion around revenue generation, I think the more effective we're going to be and securing resources and building out our sustainability programs. So my big piece of advice is don't stay focused on just the risk and the reporting and the compliance, but really start to take your sustainability programs and integrate it into your revenue strategy. And that's how you're going to get the interest of the board and the C-suite.
Amazing advice. We'll wrap it up there. I don't know how we can top that. So, Chad, thank you so much for being a guest on the podcast today.
My pleasure, Amanda. Thank you.
Whether you're a seasoned ESG practitioner or embarking on your sustainability journey, ESG Decoded is your trusted source for inspiration and actionable insights for responsible business practices. New episodes drop bi-weekly on Tuesday mornings. Make sure to subscribe on your favorite streaming platforms to be notified, and connect with us at ESG Decoded on social media or by visiting climbco.com.